A woman who cannot continue the Whitmore bloodline has no place at this table, my mother-in-law said as a waiter quietly removed my name card from the heir's dinner. Nobody looked surprised, not even my husband. I sat there for a moment with my hands folded neatly in my lap, while crystal chandeliers shimmered above the long mahogany table, and 30 members of the Whitmore family pretended not to stare at me. The ballroom at the Whitmore estate had always been designed to make people feel small. The ceilings were too high, the portraits too severe. Even the silence inside those walls felt expensive. I should have left the moment Victoria Whitmore opened her mouth, but humiliation has a strange way of freezing the body, especially when it comes wrapped in politeness. Daniel adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo without looking at me. That hurt more than her words. We had been married for 7 years. 7 years of charity galas, foundation dinners, country club brunches, and endless conversations about legacy. Legacy. That word followed me through every room in that family like perfume I could never wash off. They never asked if I was happy. They never asked if I wanted children. The only thing that mattered was whether I could give the Whitmores an heir. Mother, Daniel finally murmured softly, though there was no conviction in his voice. Victoria barely acknowledged him. Her diamond bracelet glimmered as she lifted her champagne glass. The family has waited long enough, she said calmly. Daniel deserves a future. The Whitmore name deserves security. Around the table, several relatives lowered their eyes into their wine glasses. Others exchanged uncomfortable looks, but said nothing. Silence was the Whitmore family's favorite language. They used it to hide affairs, scandals, addictions, and financial secrets. And tonight, they used it to erase me. I could hear silverware clinking softly against china somewhere farther down the table. The string quartet near the staircase continued playing as if this was just another elegant family tradition. Outside the massive windows, snow drifted slowly across the estate grounds, covering the gardens in white. Everything looked beautiful from a distance. That was the Whitmore way. Beautiful from a distance. Rotten up close. Victoria turned toward me with the same expression she once used while discussing flower arrangements for charity luncheons. Cold. Efficient. You'll be more comfortable at the lake house until the separation agreement is finalized, she said. Our attorneys have prepared everything. She slid a cream-colored envelope across the table toward me. My name was written on the front in gold lettering. Evelyn Grace Carter Whitmore. Even then, they still used the family name like a leash around my throat. Daniel finally looked at me then, but there was something empty in his eyes. Exhaustion maybe, or guilt buried too deep to reach the surface. It's for the best, he said quietly. For the best. Funny how cruel people always use gentle phrases. I stared at the envelope without touching it. 7 years earlier, when Daniel proposed to me on the terrace overlooking the Connecticut shoreline, he promised I would never feel alone again. I believed him back then. I believed all of them. I believed Victoria when she kissed my cheek at the wedding and called me daughter. I believed the family portraits meant loyalty. I believed old money came with old values. What a foolish woman I had been. A waiter appeared beside my chair carrying another place card. This one simply read guest. Not family. Not wife. Guest. I almost smiled at the precision of the insult. Victoria noticed my expression and mistook it for surrender. Thank you for understanding, Evelyn, she said softly. But I wasn't listening anymore because across the ballroom, near the coat check station, an elderly woman in a dark navy suit stood watching me. I had never seen her before. She gave the smallest nod, then disappeared into the hallway. A few seconds later, one of the staff members approached quietly and slipped something into my hand. A small silver key. No explanation. No note. Just a number engraved into the metal. 3B. I closed my fingers around it slowly while the Whitmores continued discussing the future of their precious bloodline around me. And for the first time that night, I realized something strange. I was no longer embarrassed. I was curious. The snow had stopped by the time I walked out of the Whitmore estate that night, but the cold still lingered in the air like something unfinished. The valet avoided looking directly at me as he brought my car around the circular driveway. People always became strangely nervous around family humiliation. It reminded them that wealth could protect appearances, but never dignity. I slipped the silver key into my coat pocket and drove toward the lake house in complete silence. No calls. No messages. Daniel did not try to stop me. That hurt in ways I still could not fully explain. The lake house sat nearly 40 miles north of the main estate beside a frozen stretch of water the family called Blackwood Lake. Daniel once told me his grandfather built the property for quiet weekends away from the city. I used to love it there during autumn when the trees turned copper and gold along the shoreline. Back then, I still believed peaceful places could protect unhappy marriages. By the time I arrived, it was almost midnight. The porch light had been left on for me, though I doubted it was an act of kindness. More likely another carefully rehearsed gesture designed to make the Exile appear civilized. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedarwood and old books. I set my overnight bag beside the staircase and stood in the dark living room for several seconds without moving. The silence there felt different from the estate. Less hostile, more honest. The Whitmore mansion silenced people through intimidation. The lake house silenced them through loneliness. I loosened my coat slowly and finally pulled the silver key back out into my palm. 3B. Such a small thing to disturb me so deeply. I turned it over beneath the kitchen light while trying to remember where I had seen those numbers before. Somewhere inside the estate perhaps. Some forgotten hallway or office door. My reflection stared back at me through the window above the sink. I looked older than I remembered. Not physically, emotionally. There was a particular exhaustion that came from spending years trying to earn love from people who had already decided not to give it. I poured myself a glass of water and noticed my hand trembling slightly. Not from fear, from realization. The signs had always been there. Victoria correcting the way I spoke at dinner parties. Daniel refusing to discuss children after every fertility appointment. The awkward silence whenever doctors were mentioned. Even the staff treated me differently after a while, as though the entire household quietly knew something I did not. I remembered one Christmas party 3 years earlier when Victoria introduced me to a senator's wife as Daniel's lovely companion. Companion, not wife. At the time, I convinced myself it was harmless. But cruel families do not insult people accidentally. They do it gradually, quietly, like drops of water wearing down stone. Around 1 a.m, I carried my suitcase upstairs to the master bedroom. Daniel's clothes still hung in the closet from our last weekend there together. Navy cashmere sweaters, Italian dress shirts, the expensive watch case he never traveled without. I opened the drawer beside his side of the bed and froze. Inside sat a folder stamped with the logo of Blackwood Fertility Associates. My stomach tightened immediately. I should have walked away. Instead, I opened it. The first page contained bloodwork results dated nearly 4 years earlier. Daniel Whitmore. Several medical terms were circled in blue ink. Male factor infertility. Severe reproductive impairment. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed while the room around me seemed to tilt sideways. For years I had carried the shame alone. Every failed treatment. Every uncomfortable family conversation. Every sympathetic look from strangers at charity luncheons. Victoria had allowed everyone to believe the problem was me. Even Daniel allowed it. My chest tightened, though I still did not cry. Somehow the betrayal felt too old for tears. Near the back of the folder, another document slipped loose onto the comforter. It was an invoice, paid in full. Under notes, one sentence had been typed neatly across the bottom of the page. Confidentiality agreement requested by Victoria Whitmore. I stared at those words for a long time while snow continued falling softly outside the bedroom windows. Then I noticed something else tucked beneath the folder. A photograph, old and slightly faded around the edges. A younger version of Edward Whitmore stood beside a woman I recognized instantly despite never having seen the picture before. My mother. I barely slept that night. The photograph remained on the bedside table beside the silver key while the storm outside covered Blackwood Lake in another layer of white. Around 4 a.m, I made coffee and sat near the fireplace wrapped in a wool blanket Daniel's grandmother once gave me during our first winter at the house. Back then, she used to smile whenever I entered the room. Victoria hated that. She hated anyone whose affection could not be controlled. The fire crackled softly while I studied the old photograph again beneath the dim lamp beside the sofa. My mother looked younger than I remembered her. Softer somehow. She stood beside Edward Whitmore near what appeared to be the estate gardens decades earlier, both of them smiling at something outside the frame. The familiarity between them unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. My mother rarely spoke about her past before she died. She worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood and avoided conversations about family history as though certain memories carried sharp edges. I used to think it came from poverty. Now I was no longer sure. At 7:15 that morning, my phone finally rang. Daniel. I let it vibrate across the coffee table twice before answering. You left quickly last night, he said quietly. No apology. No concern. Just observation. I stared at the snow-covered trees beyond the window. Your mother seemed eager to help with that. Silence stretched between us for several seconds. I could hear traffic in the background on his end. Probably Manhattan. Probably already back inside his normal life, while mine sat shattered across a coffee table beside me. Evelyn, he finally said. This situation has become difficult for everyone. Everyone. Another careful word. Rich people often replaced accountability with vague language. Difficult situation. Unfortunate circumstances. Family tensions. It was amazing how elegantly cruelty could be packaged when enough money surrounded it. I found your medical records, I said calmly. The silence that followed felt completely different this time. Heavy. Alert. I closed my eyes briefly and listened to him breathe. You were not supposed to see those. Not supposed to. As though the betrayal itself mattered less than my discovery of it. How long did your mother know? I asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. Since before we got married. I tightened my grip around the coffee mug until the heat burned against my palm. 7 years. 7 years of whispered pity behind my back. 7 years of fertility specialists and awkward dinner conversations while Victoria allowed society pages and charity circles to quietly blame me for the absence of children. And Daniel let her do it. Why? I asked softly. Because she said the board would never accept weakness in the family line, he answered. Weakness. That word settled into me colder than the winter outside. I almost laughed. They had treated motherhood like a corporate merger. An heir like a stock investment. Love had never entered the equation at all. You should not dig into old family matters, Daniel said after another pause. Mother is already under enough pressure. I looked toward the photograph again. Who was my mother to your father? The silence on the line became immediate and absolute. Somewhere far away, a car horn sounded briefly through his phone speaker. Then came the first genuinely shaken breath I had ever heard from my husband. Where did you hear that name? He asked quietly. Not denial. Not confusion. Fear. Real fear. I stared into the fire while something inside me slowly began rearranging itself. The humiliations. The coldness. Victoria's obsession with bloodlines. The strange looks from older staff members whenever I visited the estate archives with Edward years ago. Even his unusual kindness toward me during the early years of my marriage suddenly felt different in hindsight. More personal. More careful. There was a photograph in your drawer, I said. And I think your family has been lying to me long before the fertility treatments. Daniel lowered his voice. Immediately. You need to leave that alone. Why? I asked. Because some things can destroy this family. I looked down at the silver key resting beside the photograph. 3B. The number suddenly returned to me with startling clarity. Basement level. Archive corridor. Room 3B. Inside the Whitmore estate. The drive back to the Whitmore estate took just under an hour, though it felt much longer with every mile pulling me closer to answers I was no longer certain I wanted. The morning sky hung low and gray over Connecticut, and thin sheets of ice shimmered along the edges of the highway. I kept replaying Daniel's voice in my mind. Some things can destroy this family. Not our marriage. Not his mother. The family itself. By the time I reached the estate gates, the snow had begun falling again in soft, drifting patterns across the long stone driveway. The mansion stood ahead like something frozen in time. Tall windows. Limestone walls. Black iron lanterns glowing faintly against the storm. For years I had tried to make that place feel warm. Fresh flowers in the breakfast room. Candles in the library. Christmas garlands around the staircase every December. But warmth never survived long inside that house. The front entrance was unusually quiet when I stepped inside. Most of the family had likely returned to Manhattan after the Heir's dinner. A maid near the foyer looked startled to see me, but said nothing. That was another Whitmore rule. Staff members were expected to witness everything and acknowledge nothing. I removed my gloves slowly and walked toward the west corridor where the private elevators led to the archive level below the estate. My heels echoed softly against marble floors while portraits of dead Whitmores stared down from gold frames above me. Men with severe expressions. Women draped in pearls and silk. every generation preserving the same illusion of perfection. The basement corridor smelled faintly of dust and cedar polish. I had only been there twice before during charity inventory events years ago. Most family members avoided it entirely. Too many records. Too much history. Too many things carefully buried. Room 3B sat near the end of the hallway behind a dark oak door without a label. My pulse quickened slightly as I slid the silver key into the lock. For a second, nothing happened. Then came a quiet metallic click. The room inside was smaller than I expected. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, packed with boxes, ledgers, and old file cases stamped with decades of Whitmore history. A single green banker's lamp illuminated the center desk, casting soft golden light across the room. Someone had been there recently. There was no dust on the desk surface. No stale air. I stepped farther inside carefully and noticed one box already sitting open beneath the lamp as though it had been left waiting for me. My name rested on top in elegant handwriting. Evelyn Grace Carter. Not Whitmore. Carter. My hands felt strangely cold as I lifted the first folder. Inside were photographs, newspaper clippings, old correspondence, and at the center of everything was my mother, Eleanor Carter, younger, smiling, standing beside Edward Whitmore in gardens, at fundraisers, on the deck of a sailboat I recognized from old family portraits upstairs. In every picture, they looked comfortable together, familiar, intimate in the quietest possible way. Beneath the photographs sat a stack of handwritten letters tied with a faded navy ribbon. I untied it carefully and unfolded the first page. Edward's handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, precise. Eleanor, I regret every day that I allowed my family to force distance between us. Victoria suspects more than she admits. If anything happens to me, Arthur knows where the records are hidden. I stopped breathing for a moment. Arthur, the estate's longtime head butler. The same man who always brought me tea during winter storms. The same man who once told me I reminded him of someone he used to know. My eyes moved farther down the page. No matter what Victoria says, our daughter deserves the truth someday. The room around me seemed to collapse inward. I lowered the letter slowly back onto the desk while a roaring silence filled my ears. Our daughter. Not speculation. Not suspicion. Truth. I stared at the words over and over as though repetition might somehow change them. Suddenly, every strange moment from the past 7 years rearranged itself into something horrifyingly clear. Victoria had never hated me because I failed the family. She hated me because I belonged to it. Footsteps echoed faintly somewhere beyond the hallway outside. Slow, measured. Then a familiar voice spoke quietly from the doorway behind me. I was wondering how long it would take you to find that room. I turned sharply and found Arthur standing there holding his hands neatly behind his back. His expression carried no surprise at all, only sadness. Arthur closed the archive room door quietly behind him and stood there for a moment without speaking. He looked older in the basement light than he did upstairs, serving cocktails and managing dinner parties with perfect posture. The silver in his hair seemed sharper somehow, and the lines around his eyes carried the weight of years spent protecting secrets that were never truly his to keep. I stared at him while Edward Whitmore's letter remained open across the desk between us. You knew, I said softly. Arthur lowered his eyes briefly before answering. Yes, ma'am. The simplicity of his confession hurt more than denial would have. I looked back down at the photographs spread across the desk. My mother laughing beside Edward near the estate gardens. Edward holding an infant wrapped in a pale blanket. Me. I recognized the small birthmark near my shoulder, even though the image had faded with time. My chest tightened slowly. How long? I asked. Arthur stepped farther into the room, removing his glasses with careful hands. Since the day you were born. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Somewhere above us, the mansion continued its ordinary rhythms. Staff preparing guest rooms. Fireplaces being lit. Crystal polished for another event. Meanwhile, the truth beneath the house sat quietly waiting in cardboard boxes. Arthur looked toward the photograph beside me. Your mother worked here when she was young, he said. She handled archival restoration for the estate library. Edward met her during one of the foundation projects. His voice remained calm, though sadness lingered beneath every word. They fell in love. I almost laughed at how impossible that sounded inside a family like the Whitmores. Love was never the currency there. Power was. Appearances were. Bloodlines were. Victoria found out. Arthur continued. By then Eleanor was already pregnant. I closed my eyes briefly. My mother had spent her entire life avoiding conversations about my father. Whenever I asked as a child, she would smile gently and say, "Some families are too proud to admit their mistakes." I used to think she meant him. Now I realize she meant all of them. Edward wanted to acknowledge you publicly, Arthur said quietly. But Victoria threatened divorce, the board, the family reputation. There were concerns about inheritance complications. Inheritance. Even before I was born, I had already become a financial inconvenience. I folded Edward's letter carefully and looked at Arthur again. Why did nobody tell me? His expression shifted slightly then. Not guilt. Regret. Because Edward believed keeping you away from this family would protect you. I looked around the archive room slowly. The hidden letters. The locked door. The decades of silence. That did not stop them from destroying my life anyway. Arthur did not argue with me. He simply nodded once, as though acknowledging a fact everyone should have admitted years ago. He walked toward one of the shelves and removed a narrow black folder from the top row. "There is more," he said. Of course there was. Families like the Whitmores layered lies the way old houses layered wallpaper, one hidden beneath another until the walls became too heavy to hold themselves upright. Arthur placed the folder gently in front of me. Inside sat legal documents stamped with the Whitmore Foundation seal. Trust amendments. Estate revisions. Private correspondence between attorneys. Then I saw it. A handwritten codicil attached to Edward Whitmore's final estate plan. In the event that my biological daughter, Evelyn Grace Carter, is denied her rightful place within the Whitmore family, all controlling interests outlined below shall transfer directly to her upon formal confirmation of lineage. My hands became completely still. Controlling interests. I turned the page slowly. Shares. Properties. Foundation authority. Voting rights inside Whitmore Holdings. My name appeared again and again beneath columns of assets worth more money than I could fully comprehend. Suddenly Victoria's hatred made perfect sense. She had never feared embarrassment. She feared displacement. Every cruel dinner comment. Every quiet humiliation. Every attempt to remove me from the family had never been personal alone. It had been strategic. She needed me gone before I learned the truth. Footsteps echoed faintly somewhere upstairs beyond the archive ceiling. Arthur glanced toward the sound instinctively. "Victoria does not know Edward changed the will," he said quietly. "Only the attorneys and I were informed." I stared at the pages in front of me while something cold and steady settled inside my chest. Not revenge. Clarity. The kind that arrives when confusion finally runs out of places to hide. "There is a gala tomorrow evening in Manhattan," Arthur continued carefully. "The family intends to announce Daniel as successor to Whitmore Holdings." I looked up at him slowly. "Then I suppose," I said softly, "they are about to introduce the wrong heir." That evening I remained at the estate long after Arthur returned upstairs. The archive room had become the only honest place inside the Whitmore mansion, and I found myself unwilling to leave it too quickly. Outside the narrow basement windows, snow continued drifting across the grounds while old heating pipes hummed softly through the walls. I sat alone at the desk reading page after page of documents Edward Whitmore had hidden for decades. Some were legal revisions prepared quietly through private firms in Boston and New York. Others were personal letters written in careful handwriting that grew shakier over the years. But one thing remained consistent throughout all of them. Edward never referred to me as a mistake. He called me his daughter every single time. Around 6 in the evening, Arthur returned carrying a silver tray with tea and a small plate of toasted bread. The gesture almost broke something inside me, not because of the food itself, but because kindness felt so unfamiliar. "After years inside this family, you should eat something," he said gently while setting the tray beside the lamp. I nodded faintly, though my attention remained fixed on another document spread open before me. A confidential memorandum between Whitmore Holdings attorneys dated 12 years earlier. I read one sentence twice before speaking. "Daniel is not legally connected to the Whitmore bloodline." Arthur stood very still beside the shelves. For several seconds, only the ticking of the old wall clock filled the room. Then he removed his glasses slowly and sat across from me for the first time since I had known him. "No," he said quietly. "He is not." I leaned back in the chair while exhaustion settled heavily through my body. Somehow I had expected another twist. Another hidden corridor beneath the lie. Victoria could not have children, Arthur explained carefully. Edward arranged a private adoption shortly after their marriage. Only a handful of people ever knew the truth. I looked down at the estate documents again. Every family dinner. Every speech about preserving the bloodline. Every cruel comment Victoria made about heirs and legacy. All of it built on a secret she spent 35 years desperately protecting. Daniel knows? I asked. Arthur shook his head slowly. Edward wanted to tell him years ago. Victoria refused. She believed the truth would weaken his position inside the company. Of course she did. Everything in that family eventually returned to image, power, and control. I stared into my untouched tea while memories replayed differently now. Victoria correcting my posture during charity galas. Her obsession with proper lineage. The way she studied my face, sometimes with something colder than dislike. Fear. She had been looking at living evidence of the one thing capable of unraveling her entire life. Why did Edward leave everything to me? I asked softly. Arthur folded his hands together carefully. Because guilt changes people as they grow older. He glanced toward the letters spread across the desk. Toward the end of his life, he realized the family he built was based on silence instead of truth. He believed you deserved better than what was taken from your mother. My throat tightened unexpectedly at that. Not because of the inheritance. Because somewhere beneath all the secrecy and cowardice, Edward Whitmore had wanted to claim me. Too late perhaps, but genuinely. Arthur reached inside his coat pocket and removed another envelope sealed with dark blue wax. This arrived yesterday morning from Margaret Hale, he said. Edward's private attorney. I accepted it carefully and broke the seal. Inside was a formal invitation to the Whitmore Winter Foundation Gala at the Grand Mercer Hotel in Manhattan the following evening. Beneath the invitation sat a handwritten note. Evelyn, the board intends to confirm Daniel Whitmore as executive successor tomorrow night. Before any announcement becomes legally binding, there are matters the family can no longer conceal. Please arrive by 7:30. I folded the note slowly while the firelight from the hallway flickered beneath the archive room door. She knows everything? I asked. Arthur nodded once. Margaret helped Edward prepare the second will. Second will. The phrase itself sounded dangerous inside a family like this. Upstairs, I heard distant footsteps crossing the marble foyer. Voices. Staff preparing for another evening of appearances while the foundation beneath them quietly cracked apart. I stood and gathered the letters carefully back into their boxes. For years I had walked through this house feeling unwanted without understanding why. Now every hallway looked different. Every portrait. Every room. I was never an outsider here. I was the secret they buried beneath the foundation and prayed would never speak. Arthur rose beside me as I slipped Edward's letter into my coat pocket. Victoria will not surrender quietly, he warned softly. I looked toward the dark corridor leading back upstairs. Neither will I. The Grand Mercer Hotel glittered like a jewelry box against the Manhattan skyline the following evening. Rows of black cars lined the entrance beneath falling snow while photographers gathered behind velvet barriers hoping to capture politicians, investors, and socialites arriving for the Whitmore Winter Foundation Gala. For years I had attended those events smiling beside Daniel in designer gowns while donors praised the Whitmore family for their generosity and tradition. Tonight was different. Tonight, I arrived alone. The driver opened my door beneath the hotel awning at exactly 7:23. I stepped out wearing a dark ivory gown with long sleeves and a pearl necklace that once belonged to my mother. Nothing dramatic. Nothing loud. Wealthy women in New York understood that true power rarely needed to announce itself. Camera flashes flickered briefly as several reporters recognized me. I heard whispers immediately. I thought they separated. Was she invited? Did you hear what happened at the estate? Rumors traveled quickly in circles built on reputation. I walked past them calmly and entered the ballroom without stopping. The Grand Mercer's main hall glowed beneath enormous crystal chandeliers, while a live orchestra played near the marble staircase. White roses decorated every table beside silver candle holders and custom menu cards embossed with the Whitmore crest. Everything looked flawless. Victoria Whitmore demanded perfection the way other people demanded oxygen. Across the ballroom, I spotted Daniel standing near the stage speaking with board members from Whitmore Holdings. The moment he saw me, his entire expression changed. Not anger. Panic. Quiet, immediate panic. Victoria noticed me seconds later. Her champagne glass stopped halfway to her lips. Even from across the room, I could see the color drain slightly from her face. For a moment, nobody moved. Then society training took over. Smiles returned. Conversations resumed. The orchestra continued playing as though nothing unusual had happened. That was the strange thing about wealthy families. Catastrophe was always expected to arrive wearing evening wear. Daniel crossed the ballroom toward me quickly, lowering his voice the second he reached my side. "What are you doing here?" I adjusted one of my gloves slowly before answering. "I received an invitation. You should not have come. That seems to be a recurring opinion in your family." His jaw tightened briefly. Up close, he looked exhausted. Dark circles beneath his eyes. The kind of strain that appeared when someone spent too long protecting lies that were already collapsing. "Evelyn," he said carefully, "whatever you think you found downstairs, you do not understand the full situation." I held his gaze evenly. "Then perhaps tonight will educate me." Before he could respond, Victoria appeared beside us wearing a silver couture gown and diamonds large enough to blind small nations. Every detail about her remained perfectly composed except her eyes. Her eyes looked terrified. "You were asked to remain at the lake house," she said softly through a polished smile meant for nearby guests. "And yet here I am." Her fingers tightened slightly around her champagne flute. "You are making a mistake." I almost admired the confidence required to threaten someone while standing beneath a charity banner that read legacy through integrity. "No," I answered calmly. "I think your family made the mistake years ago." For the first time since I had known her, Victoria Whitmore seemed unable to find an immediate response. A board member approached then, interrupting the moment to inform Daniel the announcement ceremony would begin shortly. Victoria recovered instantly, placing a hand lightly against Daniel's arm as though trying to physically anchor him beside her. "Excuse us, Evelyn," she said. "Family business." The irony nearly made me smile. Daniel hesitated before walking away with her toward the stage while whispers continued spreading quietly across the ballroom. I moved toward the back of the room near the tall windows overlooking Central Park. Snow drifted softly beyond the glass while Manhattan traffic shimmered below in ribbons of gold and red. A few minutes later, an older woman in a navy velvet suit approached carrying a leather portfolio beneath one arm. "Margaret Hale, Edward's attorney." She shook my hand once, firm and direct. "You look very much like your mother tonight," she said quietly. Something inside my chest tightened unexpectedly. "Is everything prepared?" I asked. Margaret glanced toward the crowded ballroom, where Daniel now stood near the podium beneath the Whitmore Foundation crest. "The documents have been verified by 3 separate firms," she answered. "DNA confirmation was finalized this afternoon." My pulse remained strangely calm, almost detached, as though years of humiliation had burned away fear long before this moment arrived. On stage, Daniel adjusted the microphone while cameras turned toward him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began smoothly, "thank you for joining the Whitmore family tonight as we celebrate the future of our foundation and officially announce the next chapter of Whitmore Holdings." Beside me, Margaret quietly opened her portfolio. Inside rested the second will and my birth certificate. Daniel stood beneath the stage lights with the confidence of a man who had spent his entire life believing the room belonged to him. Behind him, a massive screen displayed the Whitmore Holdings crest in gold against black velvet curtains, while cameras from business networks waited near the front tables. Investors, politicians, and foundation donors filled the ballroom with polite applause as he began speaking about legacy, stability, and the future of the company. The irony settled over me almost gently now. Legacy, stability, future. Every word built upon secrets hidden beneath the Whitmore estate for more than 3 decades. Beside me, Margaret Hale removed several documents from her portfolio with precise movements. "Once the board confirms him publicly, the transfer process begins immediately," she said quietly. "This is the last possible moment to stop it." I watched Victoria standing near the stage smiling at guests with flawless composure. To anyone else, she looked untouchable, regal even. But now I noticed the tiny signs of strain beneath her elegance. The stiffness in her shoulders. The way her eyes kept searching the ballroom until they landed on me again and again. Fear had finally entered the room with us. Daniel reached the end of his prepared remarks and accepted another round of applause before continuing. My family has always believed leadership is not simply inherited. It is earned through loyalty, discipline, and bloodline responsibility. Margaret glanced toward me briefly. Remarkable timing, she murmured. I almost smiled. On stage, Victoria moved toward the podium beside Daniel and placed one hand proudly against his arm. The Whitmore family has protected its values for generations, she announced smoothly. Tonight we celebrate continuity. That word echoed through the ballroom like a challenge. Continuity, bloodline, family, lies wrapped in crystal chandeliers and couture gowns. Margaret closed the portfolio softly. Ready? She asked. I looked toward the stage one final time. Daniel avoided meeting my eyes now. Somewhere deep down, he already understood what was coming. Yes, I answered. Margaret stepped forward first. Even in a ballroom filled with billionaires and politicians, Margaret Hale carried the kind of authority that silenced people instinctively. Conversations faded as she approached the stage. Victoria's expression changed immediately. Margaret, she said sharply, though her polished smile never fully disappeared. This is hardly the appropriate moment. Actually, Margaret replied calmly. It is the legally required moment. The room fell completely silent. Daniel stepped back from the microphone while several board members exchanged confused looks near the front tables. Margaret handed a sealed document packet directly to the chairman of Whitmore Holdings before turning toward the audience. Before any succession announcement proceeds, she said clearly, there are inheritance matters connected to Edward Whitmore's estate that the board has not been informed of. Victoria's face lost color instantly. This is not the place for private family issues, she interrupted. Margaret did not even look at her. Edward Whitmore amended his estate and corporate succession directives before his death. Those amendments become enforceable upon confirmation of biological lineage. The ballroom remained frozen in complete silence except for the distant clink of silverware somewhere near the back tables. I could feel hundreds of eyes shifting between Victoria, Daniel, and me. Margaret removed a second folder from her portfolio and handed copies toward the legal counsel seated near the stage. DNA verification has been independently confirmed, she continued. Evelyn Grace Carter is the biological daughter of Edward Whitmore and the lawful beneficiary named in the amended succession agreements. The reaction spread through the ballroom like a sudden crack through ice. Shocked whispers. Chairs shifting. Someone near the press tables actually gasped aloud. Daniel stared at Margaret as though the world beneath him had physically tilted sideways. Victoria stepped forward immediately. That is impossible, she snapped, losing composure for the first time all evening. This woman manipulated Edward for years. Margaret finally turned toward her then. Calm, precise, dangerous. The documentation predates Evelyn's marriage to your son by nearly 20 years. Son, not biological son. The distinction hung invisibly in the air between them. Victoria realized it instantly. So did Daniel. His face drained completely of color. Mother, he said slowly, what is she talking about? Victoria looked toward him with something close to panic. Real panic. The kind no amount of wealth could conceal. The chairman of Whitmore Holdings adjusted his glasses while reading through the documents with trembling hands. According to these filings, he said carefully, all controlling shares transfer to Miss Carter immediately upon verification. Miss Carter, not Mrs. Whitmore, not guest. The room seemed unable to breathe. Daniel looked at me across the ballroom then, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw the truth finally reach him all at once. He was never the heir. I was. The ballroom never fully recovered after the truth came out. Even an hour later, conversations still moved in fractured whispers beneath the chandeliers, while reporters crowded near the exits, trying to confirm details from attorneys and board members. Some guests left immediately, unwilling to be photographed near scandal. Others stayed, drawn toward the collapse the way people always are when powerful families begin falling apart in public. Wealth fascinates people, but wealthy humiliation fascinates them even more. I stood near the windows overlooking Central Park while snow drifted softly beyond the glass. Across the room, Daniel remained seated alone at one of the side tables staring down at a whiskey glass he never touched. Several board members had attempted to speak with him earlier, but the conversations ended quickly. Nobody knew how to address a man who had spent his entire life preparing for a legacy that was never truly his. Victoria disappeared for nearly 20 minutes after Margaret revealed the adoption records. When she finally returned, her makeup remained flawless, but something fundamental in her expression had changed. The certainty was gone. She moved through the ballroom like someone trying to hold together a collapsing building with bare hands. Margaret approached me quietly carrying another stack of finalized documents. "The board voted unanimously," she said. "Control transfers immediately." I accepted the papers calmly. For years I imagined revenge would feel dramatic if it ever came. Loud, emotional, victorious. Instead it felt strangely quiet, like standing inside a storm after the wind had already passed. "There is one final matter," Margaret added carefully. "The estate ownership documents." I glanced down at the folder. Whitmore Estate, Blackwood Lake House, Foundation Properties. Everything Victoria spent decades protecting now belonged legally to the daughter she tried to erase. Across the ballroom, Victoria finally began walking toward me. Conversations softened around her path instinctively. Even now, people still feared her. Old habits survived longer than truth. She stopped a few feet away from me, posture perfectly straight despite the disaster unfolding around her. "You planned this," she said quietly. Her voice no longer sounded elegant, only tired. I met her gaze evenly. "No, you planned this years ago when you decided the truth mattered less than appearances." Her jaw tightened slightly. "You do not understand what families like ours require to survive." I almost smiled at that. I understand perfectly now. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The orchestra had stopped playing nearly half an hour earlier, leaving the ballroom filled only with low voices and the occasional sound of camera shutters near the lobby entrance. Victoria glanced toward the legal documents in my hands. "What exactly do you intend to do with all this?" she asked. It was the first honest question she had ever asked me. Not because she suddenly respected me, because for the first time in her life, she no longer controlled the answer. I looked around the ballroom slowly, at the crystal chandeliers, the expensive gowns, the politicians pretending not to stare, the same world that once treated me like disposable decoration. "I am not interested in preserving the Whitmore image," I said calmly. "I am interested in ending it." Something flickered across her face then. Not anger. Defeat. Real defeat. She understood at last that the family legacy she spent decades protecting would never belong to her again. Daniel finally approached us then, his expression hollow with exhaustion. He looked at me for several seconds before speaking. "Was any of it real?" he asked quietly. The question hurt more than I expected, because despite everything, there had once been love between us, or something close enough to resemble it before fear and loyalty poisoned it beyond repair. "I loved you," I answered honestly, "but you loved your family more than the truth." He lowered his eyes without arguing. That was the tragedy of men like Daniel Whitmore. They inherited power so early they never learned courage. Near midnight, I left the Grand Mercer Hotel through a private side entrance while snow covered Manhattan in silver and white. The city looked softer after storms, cleaner somehow. 3 weeks later, workers removed the bronze Whitmore family crest from the front gates of the Connecticut estate. In its place, a new plaque appeared beneath the winter sunlight. The Eleanor Carter Foundation for Women Rebuilding Their Lives. The press called it shocking. Social circles called it revenge. But standing there beside the frozen gardens while workers changed the final sign, I realized they still misunderstood me completely. I never wanted to destroy the family. I simply refused to let them bury the truth with my mother ever again.